Awesome. So, Dr. Shan, am I okay to start now?
You are okay to get going. And we'd love a brief intro. I know Sutonica, who was working with you to set this up, isn't with us at the moment. She might join in, but would love to just have a little background and then take it away.
No, no worries. Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Patrick Pilarski. Thank you very, very much for having me here virtually, I guess, as I'm still in my basement at home. But I am a associate professor at the University of Alberta, where I co-lead the Blink Lab, the Bionic Limbs for Improved Natural Control Laboratory. I'm also a CFAR AI chair. That's one of Canada's pan-Canadian AI strategies. So we have chairs across the country that are working in artificial intelligence for a variety of fundamental and applications, and also affiliated with the Alberta Machine Intelligence Institute. So the main thing I want to talk to you about today is a change that we can start to see, I think we're going to see, in how humans relate to their assistive technologies writ large, but specifically in the area of rehabilitation medicine. So that's going to be the theme of our talk today. And I'm going to try to wrap around 11:40, I guess 1:40 your time, to make sure that we have time for questions. So don't worry, I will leave time for questions. But maybe another way to think about this talk is that I would like to pitch to you the idea that limbs can keep learning. When we work with individuals with limb difference or other rehabilitation needs, when we develop assistive technologies to attach to their body that they use during their daily lives, we're now actually seeing a step change in what those devices are capable of doing. And so that's the theme of today's talk, is limbs that keep learning. Just by way of COI disclosure, I do not have any relevant affiliations to this talk. That would be COIs. I am a senior research advisor with Google and also on the board of the Alberta Machine Intelligence Institute, but those are not related to this particular work. So I guess one statement that we all likely agree on, I hope everyone here agrees on, is that prosthetic control, feedback, and interventions and user training can all be improved through the adaptation and sculpting of these things to actual individuals and their unique body and needs. And so now if we were all in like a big room together, I'd look around and see some of you nodding. Most of you would probably be nodding right now. One statement that might be controversial, and this is where we're going to spend most of our time in this particular talk, is that assistive technologies, especially prosthetic devices, should continually adapt and sculpt their control and feedback to individuals and their needs during their post-clinical deployed use. So this is, again, I think maybe the more of the controversial statement. To set this up, I'm going to use, humor my cartoon representation. We have people represented by these little meeples and devices represented by the little orange cubes. And what we typically see is that a person's input, a person's needs will be used to sculpt a device, be this a prosthesis or an orthotic or a brace or a seating solution that's created in the clinic. And then for more or less the rest of that device's use, the person adapts to the device. So this is a very short period of adaptation of a person to the tools that they'll be using in their daily life or the assistive device they're going to be using. And then they spend a lot of time adapting to it. And this actually works really, really well, as we can see in challenges like the Cybathlon competition, especially the upper limb arms race of the Cybathlon, essentially the Rehab Olympics. People using, say, hook and cable prostheses are able to do very amazing things through their continued adaptation to their fixed device. The device isn't really adapting to them, but they've done an amazing job adapting and improving in their control of their device. Recently, especially in the area of neuroprostheses, we've seen a change in the capabilities of how humans can control those devices. And so in this case, solutions like machine learning-based pattern recognition are able to allow a device to adapt to a person. The person spends some time adapting to the device and the control system that they've worked to create inside that device. And then the device is able to be readapted to that person. And this could even be done throughout the course of daily life. For instance, some of the new upper limb machine learning control solutions for prostheses, for robotic prostheses, the user can push a button, the arm will show a series of motions, and that person can give more signals from their body, for instance, signals from their muscles, myoelectric control, to improve how that device will operate given their current needs, how much they're sweating right now, what they're going to be doing. So there is that adaptation process. And currently, a lot of the major companies and researchers are thinking about how data from many people can in fact be used to improve that control system, improve the person's interaction with their device, in those instances when the person and the device have essentially agreed that they are going to improve the control intervention on the device itself. So the focus of this talk is in fact a third way, another way where in fact the person and the device continually co-adapt. The person is always adapting to the device, but the device is actually and continually adapting to the person. So that's going to be the focus of this talk. My learning objectives, I like to specify learning objectives as well, is that by the end of this, you're going to come out of this with a set of shared terms that we can all use. For instance, terms like continual learning, which you may or may not already be familiar with, and a set of really a minimal set of concrete examples of what is technologically possible right now, such that we could all sit down in a room and discuss in a very interdisciplinary way the similarities, differences, and merits of each of those three pathways I just showed you on the previous slides for meeting user needs. I'm not trying to suggest today whether one or more of those pathways is the ideal pathway, but I'd love for us all to come out of this being able to sit down someday at a conference and talk about that clearly with solid language and good examples. So that's my hope for all of this for today. And I like to motivate this. Some of you have probably seen the Chiroto. I often use this to motivate my talks, but I very much enjoy starting with the Chiroto because this is an example of one of the oldest sort of on record neuroprostheses that people have used. In this case, it was a wooden prosthesis. And what's striking about this is that the evidence shows that this particular device was adapted and changed over the course of its use to its users. So this was not just a device that was made and then worn, it was made and occasionally changed. It was almost that middle way that we were seeing in a very sort of handmade kind of direction. But what I think is interesting as well about this, and why I like to motivate with this particular slide of a toe prosthesis, is that this is how it's gone for literally thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, that people have had needs, they have built tools to address those needs, and then they have changed to those tools. This is the socio-technical gyre that has gone back for again hundreds of thousands of years and changed the society. Everything from bicycles to prostheses has changed how we live. But we're now at a very critical point in the evolution of our species and in the evolution of our technology, in that we are now capable of creating devices that can adapt while they are being used by a person. This is actually fairly miraculous if we step back and think about it. And what's more, we can start to imbue the devices we create, especially our rehabilitation tools, with the very hallmarks of intelligence itself. And so this is a turning point for what we do, especially in the areas of rehabilitation. And so I like to think about this. That was just a contrast. The Chiroto, this is just a selection of devices, both research and commercial, that we have in our bionic limbs laboratory on the University of Valor campus. And the change has really been not just in how we fabricate devices, but also in the sensor technology that we deploy, the actuators, the very things that power these devices, the power systems, and advanced computing technologies. Like we have now microelectronic components that can in fact run machine learning and some of the basic forms of artificial intelligence right on device. So to think about this really clearly, again, I would like for us to step through some of the fundamentals of this interaction. I'm assuming many of you are in fact experts in neuroprosthetic interactions, or in how, say, someone with limb difference might interact with their rehabilitation device, their artificial limb. But I'm going to step through it just in case some of you aren't. And so one of the main pathways we usually think about in upper limb prosthetic control is the control pathway. This is the pathway by which intent or will from the human body is mapped to the actual motions that an upper limb prosthesis is infecting in the world around it. So this might be the sampling of myoelectric signals from the muscle and the residual limb, and then a mapping of those signals to the way that the hand actually moves, the way a robotic hand might open or close, or a person's wrist might rotate, or their elbow may bend for someone with a transhumeral amputation. And so the control pathway is perhaps the dominant pathway, the most studied pathway, with some very advanced interventions starting to bubble up even in the 1960s in terms of using advanced computing for affecting this control pathway. recently there has been an upsurge in using machine intelligence to essentially broker that connection between the person and the machine. So I like to think about this as machine intelligence beginning to form the universal glue between the person and the machine, wherein an arbitrary set of signals from the human body can be mapped to all the many different modes or functions or control features of the upper limb robotic prosthesis. And so in this case, you can see I just have a sketch up here, a cartoon of how a space of signals coming from the human body is by way of that machine intelligence system that you might think of it like a network or a some kind of control system with a series of parameters, weights or knobs to turn, maps that information to all of the different motions of the robotic hand. So this has become now, in fact, a go-to solution for upper limb prosthetic control, is the use of one or more different forms of machine intelligence to mediate that relationship. We're also seeing the feedback pathway. And so the feedback pathway is a very, I would say, understudied pathway of interacting between the person and the machine, in this case, the upper limb prosthesis. Typically, we might see someone with a upper limb prosthesis that is listening to the whir of the motors in their device. They actually can feel the mechanical vibrations by way of their socket, or they visually watch. We have a lot of research we've actually done here at University of Alberta, looking at how people's gaze is affected by the level of feedback that they have from a neuroprosthetic device. And you can see that people will visually and auditorily monitor their device quite actively, especially as they're doing tasks that are quite complex. And so the feedback pathway is in fact understudied. There are lots of things people have tried in terms of making a more effective path from feedback from what the device is feeling to what the person is perceiving about their device. And that includes everything from vibration to electrical stimulation to mechanical devices that poke into the residual limbs tissue. And very recently, this again is understudied. We've actually pursued quite a bit of work here at the University of Alberta on this particular direction, is again using machine learning to broker that pathway flowing from the machine back to the person. So the ability for machine learning to help communicate the sense of touch or proprioception or kinesthesia back to the person that's using the device. I do also want to call out a number of surgical interventions as well that have come online in recent years, including things like targeted sensory and motor reinnervation, the rewiring of the nerves so that a person can more naturally, intuitively give clear control signals to their device, and also perceive much more concretely, and in some cases in a much more physiologically mapped sense, what their device is doing when their device actually when their device touches something. They can feel it as if it was touching the finger they no longer have. Also, recent work by Paul Marasco and colleagues, including some of my colleagues here at the university, looking at allowing a device to communicate back the sense of proprioception and kinesthesia, the sense of where an arm is in space and how it is moving, back to the person using the device. I'd be remiss also not calling out some of the interventions that have helped more tightly connect people and the machines that are supporting their needs. This is work by Max Ortiz-Catalan and his team on osseointegration in the upper limb, effectively bone integration, as opposed to using sockets or slings and harnesses to connect a device to the human body, using direct bone integration. And in the case of Max and his team's work, looking at then connecting directly to muscles and nerves as well by way of that titanium implant. So this is another very tight coupling between a person and a machine that is very customized to that person's body and their needs. Okay, so stepping back and looking at the control pathway, the feedback pathway, all of the surgical interventions that have been created around those pathways, and the new technologies like osseointegration that are coming online now and are actually seeing clinical use. I think we probably all still agree. I'm going to hazard a guess. Again, I can't see all of you, but I'm going to guess that we all still agree that prostheses can be improved and adapted and sculpted to individuals, their unique bodies and needs, and that this in fact is probably a good thing. I'm just going to quickly check the chat here to see if there's anything else. No, okay, there's nothing critical in chat. I always like to monitor all the channels as I'm giving a virtual talk. Okay, so in that pause break, I'll reflect on this one more time. We likely all still agree that prostheses can be improved and adapted to individuals and what those individuals actually need. So I will now say something again that sort of hits on that second statement I made at the beginning of the talk, which is that, in fact, modern prosthetic technology now has all of the right elements so that the system itself can instruct and enhance its operation over time while it's deployed with users, not just in the short term, but over extended periods of time as well. We're actually seeing, again, I mentioned in that slide where I showed the sort of that cornucopia of prosthetic technology, that the sensors, the actuators, the computation, and the power systems all now enable us to have very adaptive, very constructive prosthetic devices. And this really is, I mentioned that I'd love for us to have a set of very consistent terms. Continual learning is one of these terms that I hope to dwell on today. If you only come away with with one term for the entire talk, I would be really happy if you were to come away with a appreciation of the idea of continual learning. So I'm not going to go into the depths of like unsupervised and supervised learning and reinforcement learning. We're not going to get into really deep into the weeds of those different technologies today. But I will say that continual learning is special, it's different, and it's something that only very recently has become the focus of the machine learning and artificial intelligence community. And it is the constant and incremental development of knowledge and behaviors. So this is there's a great summary in the machine learning context by Kim McCartapal and Doina Prekup and others, and earlier work by Mark Ring. But I really think this is an exciting kind of machine learning because it allows a system to continue to learn during deployed operation, learn about context-specific things, learn in a way that is agnostic to the task or the operation being performed by the person, and learn in an incremental way such that it can continue to improve systems. Machine systems can continue to improve and change and adapt to, in the prosthetic setting, to the person as the person's needs and biology changes, to the environment that the device is being used within, and to the changes in a prosthetic device itself as it ages and modifies it physically over its sustained operation. And again, contrasting continual learning with other forms of machine learning. In fact, pattern recognition, one of the other dominant machine learning solutions for upper limb prosthetic control, wherein data is sampled, it's boiled down into a control solution, and then it is deployed. That's very different than a system that is continually adapting and changing, where data comes in and is immediately used to improve or update the operation of the system. That's continual learning. And when we think about continual learning, I like to put in, this is the landscape I usually present when I'm especially when I'm talking to my clinical colleagues about how artificial intelligence and machine learning is deployed, especially in a prosthetic setting, is that we really do see a pipeline from data, from the input of data to the achievement of goals by way of decisions that are made by devices or by the people sculpting the intervention. And so this is really made up of, in my opinion, three things: representations, the way that a machine, like a control system in a prosthetic limb, represents or perceives its environment, perceives the setting of use; the predictions that system makes, the models that it makes about the patterns or regularities in the world. In conventional pattern recognition, that might be the way that it perceives patterns from the human body as the muscles of residual limb contract, and that assigns mappings to the different motions of the prosthesis: hand open, close, or wrist rotation, or wrist flexion for systems that have wrist flexion. And the other pathway is actions, the actual actions that a robotic device might take in response to the human's input. And this could be both control, or it could also be feedback. For the purpose of this talk, though, I'm going to streamline this down and really think mostly about the continual adaptation of predictions, or the models that predictive models about the future that a prosthetic device like an upper limb neuroprosthesis begins to make about its own operation, about the way that a person is using the device, and the way that the device interacts with its environment. And I will just say that for those who want to sort of dive a little bit deeper, that continual learning is very, very much rooted in reinforcement learning. So the whole problem setting and field of reinforcement learning from machine learning, and also biological learning, wherein systems learn through trial and error over extended periods of time to optimize some kind of behavior. I'm not going to go into the depths of reinforcement learning today, or temporal difference learning, but I will say that if you are interested in what we're chatting about today, especially the kinds of continual learning mechanisms that I'm talking about, they are fundamentally coupled to temporal difference learning, which is essentially the learning update rule which powers most of modern reinforcement learning. So I just want to call that out right now. So the key example that I'd like to give you is, in fact, something that we have worked on in the lab here for well over a decade now. And it's, I should have updated that to say 2023. I guess my slide is out of date. It is indeed 2023. I've lost almost a year. Key example is adaptive and autonomous switching. This is going to be something that we have studied again and again in our lab, and is at its heart a process of continual learning, a machine learning what a person wants and when they want it, such that they can have the device operation that they truly desire. To get into how we have pursued adaptive switching, I'm going to go back in the Wayback Machine to the work that we were doing at the University of Alberta between around 2010 to 2013. And this was when we were first starting to pioneer targeted sensory reinnervation at the University of Alberta. My colleague, Dr. Jacqueline Hebert, Dr. Ming Chan, and others brought sensory reinnervation to the University of Alberta and our Glen Rose Hospital here. And started to work with patients and participants to essentially rewire the nerves of the upper limb so they could have very, very discrete sensation of what their artificial limb was feeling. So the gentleman on the right here, after targeted sensory reinnervation surgeries, was able to use this simple robotic system, our old myoelectric training tool, to grab a ball. His eyes were covered. He had noise canceling headphones, and he was using this robotic limb, using his rewired muscles. He said, okay, I'm squeezing the ball. Yep, I feel how hard I'm squeezing the ball. I'm lifting it up now. Okay, I've lifted it up. I'm dropping it. I can feel it slipping from my grasp. I'm no longer holding the ball. And so this was a really transformative study. It was very exciting to see that in action, see someone actually feeling with a robotic system as if it was their old biological limb. And all the while this person was performing this interaction, this sensory involving both the control pathway and the feedback pathway, we were deploying continual learning machine learning systems to see if we could in fact have that robotic limb begin to predict all aspects of the data stream, all aspects of that interaction between the person and the machine in both the control and the feedback pathways. And we found that, in fact, we could indeed continually learn forecast predictions about the future. These are things that the machine was learning about not what was happening, not able to predict what was happening right now in this sensory motor interaction, sensory motor stream. But in fact, the system was able to predict the future of, when that person might experience that compression of the force of the object they were gripping, what the velocities of all the joints in the system would be doing, the different angles, and even began to predict things like the myoelectric signals that were coming from the person's residual limb. So we showed that, like, again, in a very ongoing incremental fashion, a machine could begin to learn key salient facts, models about a person's interaction with their prosthetic technology, and update and maintain these. And again, these aren't just a prediction about like, how hard will it be squeezing in half a second. It was really these long temporally extended predictions about the future of the sensory motor interaction at many different timescales. So this is wrapped up in one of our first articles in Robotics and Automation magazine, which if you're interested in specifically what kind of predictions were made and how they're being made, I encourage you to go check out that. I see a hand. Pratik, yes, please.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get my video to start. Give me just a second. My apologies, it's not there as yet.
Hey, no worries.
Sorry, I was running behind. Very nice to meet you. My background is primarily, I'm a physiatrist with a PhD in biomedical engineering. A little bit more work in the sphere of prosthetics, not directly with interfaces or development, but more with the clinical part of things. So this is a very interesting slide. If we can actually predict a number of these parameters, that is fantastic. It seems like the force and the angle are pretty well predicted when we are looking at these, but the velocity vector itself is not. So I don't know if you have a comment on that.
Yeah, it's interesting because you might think this is great. Thank you for the question. You might think that in fact, if you're trying to predict the temporally extended future, that you would hope to predict the time series exactly as it is. So you see those velocity spikes. In fact, the way that temporal difference learning will be working, and when we are thinking about those extended spans, is that as you're actually creating a expectation of some kind of weighted future. So this is saying, like, it actually is a different learning target than trying to match exactly. And because of that, you can get out very different, almost like the Fourier fundamental elements of the future at different time scales. It's like saying, I'd love to know how much rain is going to fall on Friday. You can also say how much rain is going to fall over the entire week. Also noting that I care a lot about Saturday and Sunday because that's when I'm going to be out in the yard with my family. And so it's a different quantity that's being estimated and created and expected during this process of continual updates. So yeah, that is a really great observation. And thanks for giving me a chance to clarify that on here. That helps. So I'll just say as well, just in line with that question, is that we showed that this just scales not just from a couple of predictions, but in fact to tens of thousands of forecasts that could be learned and made in real time while a robot limb was being used. And so this is an example of the modular prosthetic limb that we have at the University of Ottawa campus. And about 18,000 different predictions were being made and updated in real time, including predictions of sensory motor behavior, surprise factors. Like I came up at one point, I shook the robot's hand, and you could see like little bits of its robotic brain flared up because it was surprised. No one had ever backdriven the motors before. And so we've shown that, in fact, we can quite actively scale the number of predictions. And these are predictions about all aspects, again, of the data stream, about the position and load and velocities of 17 or more different control actuators, myoelectric signals coming from the human body, the temperatures of these joints. And let me just make sure that I'm just going to double check what my next slide looks like if I don't dwell on it. Okay, I don't dwell on it. So I will say that in fact, that some of these allow us to understand quite a bit about the operation of that neuroprosthetic system, including things like when it breaks and when it fails. But one of the most important pieces of all of this, and like, again, going back to that last question, is that we are seeing like the ability to generate predictive models of a person's interaction with their prosthesis and that prosthesis interactions. The neat thing about this, thing that I think I wanted to dwell on adaptive switching, is that we are able to do something really straightforward in terms of using those predictions to improve someone's prosthetic interactions. We can look at how we might start to map those continually learned predictions to fixed outcomes to provide more natural and more complex or adaptive interfaces. And this is a really simple idea that we can use those continually learned predictions to change the interface, to change that glue, which connects the person and the assistive device that is trying to support them in their daily life and their daily needs. And so this is where we get to adaptive and autonomous switching. I want to set it up with that understanding of these temporally extended predictions, because in adaptive and autonomous switching, we're using those predictions to do something, again, I think really straightforward, which is to adapt the switching list that someone is presented when using their device. So especially for a high degree of control robotic limb, say an upper limb prosthesis with, let's just say, shoulder actuators, elbow actuators, wrist flexion and rotation, and many different hand grafts or functions. If we see someone with limb difference, an upper limb amputation, let's say, with limited control channels, one of the dominant ways to approach this is, in fact, to have those limited control channels mapped to all of those other controllable functions by way of a single channel and voluntary or manual switching on the part of the person. And this is true for a prosthesis. You could imagine them co-contracting their muscles to switch between many different hand modes or functions. I think the Zeus hand by Aether and a number of other commercial prostheses use that particular switching modality to access a wide range of grasp patterns in a say a hand prosthesis. You can imagine someone hitting a button on their shoulder. This is very similar as well to what we see in other technologies like exoskeletons, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But the idea of adaptive and autonomous switching is that you may be faced with a large control list, a large list of functions, and the person has to manually sort through that in some kind of menued fashion. Adaptive and autonomous switching does something very straightforward. It, over time, builds predictions of which modes, functions, or different kinds of features of the device a person will use and when they will use those modes or functions. And then when the person goes to perform the act of manual switching, the device will start to reorder, dynamically change the order of functions that they're presented with, such that they get what they want when they want it. And in some cases, even perform that act of switching for them. So I'll just show one example. This is a very simple task. We have this gentleman here asking him to move this robotic arm to one side of the workspace, and I think it's to wave, and the other side, and open and close his hand. So a very, very simple task. To do that, he has to switch through all the different modes or functions of this particular robotic arm. You can see here we have very very purposely put his switching channel on his biologically intact limb, so you can really see him making these switching actions. Every time he flicks his wrist, he's using myocontrol to switch between the modes or functions of this device. And then on his left limb, the residual limb, he has essentially a single two-part control channel, which is allowing him to move the arm. And what you just noticed was him making a facial expression there, because he's now getting exactly the mode or the function he wants when he wants it. This trial just started when he just started using it at the beginning of this video, and the system is already adapted to the order that he might switch and use the different joints of the robotic arm in that control list. So the system is adapting and changing, and it's doing so not in the order of days or weeks, it's doing so on the order of minutes, which I think is really exciting as well. The ability for systems to adapt very quickly to the user and how they're using a system. So under the hood, I'll just dwell a little bit more on predictions, because especially given we had a question on temporally extended predictions already, which warmed my heart, I would like to just dwell a little bit more on this. And again, the idea here is really simple. I'm not pitching you some gigantic, vast, deep neural network that is going to build all these highly complex abstract representations. What I'm showing here is, again, a very simple example on purpose of a system that is going to, the solid bars on this plot. I wouldn't be a proper researcher if I didn't, like scientist, if I didn't show you a bunch of wiggly lines on a plot at least once during this talk. And so what I'm showing you here is a series of solid blocks, which are when a person actually uses the different joints of the robotic arm. In this case, we have elbow, shoulder, hand, and wrist of the robotic arm. And the solid lines are the system's learned predictions of the person's use. And then adaptive and autonomous switching, again, I promise something very simple. It simply looks and rank orders the predictions of the person's use of the different joints and functions, and then gives them a new switching list to allow them to switch more effectively through the modes and functions of the device based on those learned predictions. And what's interesting here, we had an article in Prosthetics and Orthotics International, and this is just one of the many confirmations we had that this reduces the number of manual switches required of the person, the number of actual control interventions to solve the task, for instance, like a box and blocks placement task, and also reduces the time to complete those tasks for the person. We have feedback from the people as well. And we even see that the system can learn predictions of when they're going to switch and switch for them in high confidence situations. And I'll just say, as we start to, Pratik, can I hold your question for one more second? I'm gonna tear through the slide, and then I will absolutely come back to you. I've showed you adaptive switching in an upper limb prosthesis. I want to say that we've deployed these exact same technologies in adaptive switching for real-time exoskeleton control. This is work by Freedy et al., published in iCore in 2022, looking at using adaptive switching to adapt the different turning and speed modes of a powered exoskeletal system. Our colleagues have used it for interspinal microstimulation for standing and walking. In this case, it was in a cat model. We've looked, as I noted earlier, at how these same kind of predictions learned and updated in real time can be used to detect failures in a robotic system or detect anomalies in the person's use. We've looked at hazard prediction and also machine learned feedback, like, oh, wow, you're going to squeeze. We're doing an experiment right now in the lab where one of my students is looking at the system, a person using a myoelectric controlled robotic arm to crush objects, and have the system begin to give them a cue based on predictions of when those objects might actually crush or when they might be damaged. And a series of other works where we've used comparable systems to look at coordinating multiple joints or actuators. If I'm reaching up for a ball, I want my wrist and my hand to move at the same time, so I might be able to actually catch that ball or shake someone's hand naturally. We've looked at using those same continually learned predictions to help manage some of those coordination issues in the joints. So this is, I gave you one example, but I wanted to sort of fill out this particular spectrum for you. All right, Pratik, yes, please. Your question.
This is very exciting, I must say. This is excellent work. If you go back a couple slides, I just had a question that I'm not sure is the right question, but I would ask it anyways. The magnitude, when you have the prediction graph, are we looking at the magnitude as well, and does that actually have any impact on the ultimate control of the prosthetic device? Yeah,
it does. There are some normalization factors you might imagine in terms of the maximum. These are normalized graphs, in fact, because depending on what you're predicting about the data stream, you may choose to respect the magnitudes of the sensors. Like if you had a joint that swung wildly, and you were looking at it in terms of like servomotor increments as opposed to angles or something like that, and a joint that swings only a little bit, the changes that you might be predicting might be on very different scales. The system itself doesn't really, like the process of continual learning by process of temporal differences, it is not particularly sensitive to those scales, which is a lovely thing about it. But yeah, we might choose to scale them, and you might choose to do that act of reordering differently based on the expected time that a person might spend, say, dwelling within a different activity. Like if you're using the shoulder a lot and then the hand only opens and closes, the prediction magnitude would be a lot lower because there's less signal of interest to essentially accumulate in that prediction. And that just needs to be taken into account, but it's not really a blocker. It just does require careful thought as to, and understanding the actual data stream that you would be interacting with. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, and I will say one more thing is that one of the first things we tried, control is hard. One of the first things we tried before diving into these methods of mapping predictions to control interventions, one of the first things we tried was, in fact, human training of robotic limb using reinforcement learning. And I'll just sort of give the TLDR on this so we can get to question period more quickly, in that we showed that a person could just give like good, bad feedback, kind of like you'd give a puppy, to actually train a robotic limb to interpret signals, myoelectric signals coming from the human body. So this was very much a person it's like clicker training, giving good and bad feedback to the robotic arm and showing that they could create a very user customized, subjectively grounded control policy just based on essentially good, bad feedback that they were delivering. Clearly, that's a very time-intensive method for the users. This was a proof of concept. I personally would not go and be like, all right, go and train your prostheses like you train a puppy. No one wants their prosthesis to, like, I don't know, pee on the floor and sleep on the couch and when they don't want it to. But it was very interesting for us to be able to see that, yes, we could actually, just using good, bad feedback, train a myoelectric control policy and have people actually train that policy. So that was one of the first things we did. And I did want to call it out because I think it's a very different style of work that now may in fact be scalable to commercially deployed prostheses. So I'll just go back and summarize all of this last sort of wash of examples that I've given you and sort of the technical underpinnings, and say that continual learning and the construction of control and feedback. In this case, we talked mostly about the continual construction of predictions on the part of the machine. It is in essence putting the person and their needs front and center. So this is saying that, in fact, the system core job of the system is aligned to and to adapt to its user, and then try to change in a safe and stable way to meet the user's goals and needs. So this is a very compelling thing for me, at least, when I think about limbs that learn and continually adapt, is that, in fact, it does let us put the person, the unique person, front and center, and not try to do some act of averaging across many, many different people with many different biological contexts and needs, and then trying to do that fine-tuning process ourselves to make it exact for them. This allows the system to take a lot of that burden on itself. And in fact, the person is adapting to the tool, and the tool can also adapt to the person. And we have solid evidence, really, that this is now technically and computationally possible. This is something that we did not have many, many years ago. And I think it's possible. In fact, I can confirm this possible with modern prosthetic hardware, not the prosthetic hardware of a decade from now, not in 5 years, but in fact, we now can have continual learning systems on today's prosthetic hardware. And the main question that comes out of this is like, all right, I've hopefully convinced you that we have systems that are capable of continually adapting to their users. I hopefully convinced you that there are good reasons that we may want systems to do this. And then the right question is this the right time to do it? And what critical evidence do we have? And so I will say that, in fact, again, it's clinically viable if we work across disciplinary boundaries. What we have, I think, that supports the further investigation of these continual learning methods in modern clinical prostheses is a set of technologies that are in fact compatible with standard approaches. What I love about, say, adaptive autonomous switching is that it starts with a gold standard of sequential switching. It only gets better over time, and when it fails, it defaults back to the gold standard. So this is in fact a really compelling thing for me, and it also is compatible with many other different kinds of technologies that we already see in clinical deployment. Many of the things that we're doing in the field of upper limb prosthetics, whenever we go to the Myoelectric Control Symposium in New Brunswick, we see people that are increasingly showing that upper limb prosthetic devices can adapt to the users. They can be the the pattern recognition control systems can be retrained at the push of a button. They can accumulate data over time. So people are already moving towards slowly tracking and changing prosthetic control systems. So this is something that is in fact already capturing the mind share of both researchers and companies creating prosthetic solutions. We can, in fact, deploy systems like the ones I'm showing you with very small compute and low or no user burden, which is also nice. You don't require a supercomputer in a cloud to do many of the things that I was discussing with you today. And we now have better outcome measures to capture how the person and the machine are interacting. I know we have a study going on in the lab right now where we have gaze tracking motion analysis, our gaze and movement analysis suite, and also in-depth qualitative discourse analysis. We are starting to look at how people actually use their upper limb prosthetic devices as they continually change and adapt. So we have the right outcome measures as well, I think, to capture what we need to capture. The things we don't have, the need to have, in my opinion, are an evidence base for what happens during long-term co-adaptation between a person and a assistive rehabilitation device that changes very actively and proactively. We don't also have data-driven insight into what user training needs to look like. User training is, I think we all know, an incredibly critical part of how a person will begin to use and continually use their rehabilitation technologies, their assistive device. And we don't have great data-driven insight into how to train people to use machines that will continually adapt. I think we're getting good evidence from pattern recognition systems that are deployed in clinical use, but we do need more evidence, in my opinion. And we're not all the way to having prosthetic devices that can understand their context of use, to be able to more automatically, without, say, RFID tags, be able to know that you're in the kitchen making coffee, or that you're going for a stroll, or that you're on a photography outing, or that you're at your job. And we don't also have a good balance of what the short term, the forgettable learning, and the long term, the non-forgettable learning should look like, especially in a prosthetic control system. So to really bring things home and open up for question sessions, I think that it's really important that we do think about this universal glue, this interface between the person and the machine, and think of it as something that is continually constructed and updated during continual interactions, because doing so unlocks what I think is really transformative change in how we think about human interactions with neuroprosthetic devices writ large. I think we have a very special opportunity. I've been making this pitch to many folks when I give talks lately, and I'm going to do it again here, is that I believe that we can go beyond coding channels. So I think many of you will appreciate that for almost the entire history of thinking about upper limb prosthetic devices, we've tried to think about how we put bits on wires. We've tried to think about how we essentially encode information from the human body, squeeze it into a very limited pathway that flows between the person and the machine, and then decode it on the other end. We even have the idea of decoders in brain-computer interfaces. There's a lot of work on decoding the signals from the human brain. And I think we can actually do something different if we think about the way that humans interact, that animals and animals interact. They are in fact founding and grounding their interactions on models that they make of each other and change. The whole idea of joint action from the human-human interaction literature, or folks like Tom Scott Phillips thinking about ostensive inferential communication, how people are able to make their internal state overt to others and change the models of others. We now have machines and people that can both change their models of the world and each other. I think this allows us to go beyond simply stuffing bits on wires, and in fact go to interfaces that are constructed between a person and a device during the ongoing interactions, based on the premise that both systems can begin to better and better model and co-adapt each other. That lets us pass almost limitless amount of information for free without trying to go through this intricate act of encoding and decoding. We pay a little bit in terms of time, but I think we gain in terms of the ability for a person and their assistive technologies to co-adapt over both the short and the long term. So with this in mind, I'm just going to close with this slide. If it boots up, I see it. Maybe you're seeing it too. In that we can start to get towards. I'm going to go forward one. Okay, there we go. I can see it now, so I hope you can see it. Is that we can start to do what folks like Licklider, JCR Licklider said back in the 1960s, and I'm going to paraphrase a quote from Licklider, say that someday not too far from now, we'll begin to see tight couplings of humans and machines, which are able to think like no human has ever thought before and process information unlike any information processing system known to date. And so I think with the kinds of technology we've talked about today and the foundation of technology in our rehabilitation landscape, we can start to think about tightly coupled systems as would have made Licklider happy, and think about this coupling that can in fact operate in a way that no system known today has been able to. So with that, I think we are at a very special time, and I think we have a great opportunity ahead of all of us, as long as we can all work together in a very interdisciplinary sense. So with that, I'd like to thank you all very much for having me for this tech talk. I hope it was the right level of technical for all of you on this video call, and now I'm very much happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Patrick, for that wonderful talk. We have a really good mix of audience here. I thank Lauren for starting up the session. We have Patrick and we have Prateek and Ashley from the Limb Care Networking Group, and hopefully other audience members as well, and also members from the Technology Networking Group here too. I think this was a really good mix of conversation between the two groups. And I invite audience members to either unmute and ask questions, or you can also feel free to put your questions in the chat. Patrick, my background in technology and usability makes me want to ask this question, primarily to think about what you talked about users, user training, and what that might include. So I wanted to ask, to what extent do you think the learning curve could potentially be influenced with what you talked about at the very end about moving beyond just using the coding process? How do you think the learning curve could potentially be affected?
Yeah, I think there's some. I love this question. We could talk for like probably hours on this particular point. I still remember when we were first pitching the as a sidebar, we were first pitching the reinforcement learned control of prosthetic limbs at, I think it was ICOR back in Zurich in 2011. We were first presenting that work, and one of the folks from Autobot came up to me and it was like, "Hey, so like that was really cool, but what about this co-adaptation process? Like, what about the speeds of co-adaptation that happen? Like, how fast does the person adapt to the machine? How fast does the machine adapt to the person?" That question has been like stuck in my mind for well over a decade now. And I think what's neat is that we're getting to the point where, in fact, the machine can start to play a role in governing the rates. We're able to, like, there's some really cool work, actually some work being done by Dr. Ahmed Shahata in our lab and others on looking at like psychometric modeling of an individual. And we can start to see, I think, actual quantitative measures that a machine can use to start to govern the rates. And so this goes back to the modeling part, like the ability for a machine to not just have a model of a person, but to continually update it. Like, where is there high variability in someone's ability to grasp an object? Where is there a lot of instability in their gaze, or where do they really fixate on their arm as they're moving an object from one position to another? Those kind of things are in fact perfect fodder for the machine building a model of the person, and then gating its control and also signaling to the clinical team that's working in this in the environment around the individual and their device, signaling to them that these are areas where more training can be useful, or where a particular training vector might in fact be functional. Like I think about the person, the machine, and their co-adaptation really is this vector that can spiral off into space. And we don't actually, again, I don't think we have a good model as to how this interaction unfolds as we think about it as a co-adaptive process. But what we do have, I think, is our tools now to say, from a given starting point, which is unique to this person and this machine, and given this training environment, and given the different nuances of the person, the machine, can we start to get forecasts about how that interaction, that training interaction, is going to essentially unspool in time and in space? And once we have that, I think then we can start to deploy technologies, both clinical technologies and more autonomous technologies on the part of the device itself, like during take-home use, to start to optimize the training environment to a person to help them get the most out of their device. So yeah, I really like this. Again, we could talk for a very long time on it. I think it's a really, really cool opportunity for us. On the machine learning side, we've seen really huge sort of gains in terms of what's considered active learning on part of the machine. What that essentially is our technologies that are able to, like, I'm showing flashcards, let's say, and it's like flashcard of a gecko. It's like, oh, cool, that's a gecko. I show you a flashcard of a bird. Oh, that's a bird. Now it shows like a frog, and it's like, I need to see more of those. Help me understand the difference between the gecko and the frog. And so the machine itself will start to understand where it doesn't have enough information about a particular class or a particular policy that is trying to form, a particular way of acting. This is equally applicable to machine learning of prosthesis control, where a system might say, like, wow, I know you were giving me this motion. I don't know what that means in this context. And the system itself can start to then say, more samples here, please. Can you show me a couple more examples of you doing that reaching and grasping task? In the lab, we have Heather Williams is studying the limb position effect. This is essentially, oh, wow, if you reach up, suddenly your muscles move and the muscle signals change. And a prosthetic limb might not be able to interpret your hand open, close motions or any other motions because of that change in context. And so this is another, just a very similar example, like, oh, wow, as a person is doing different motions in different sort of limb contexts, can the system start to model its reliability in each of those limb positions, let's say, and then begin to suggest further training? Heather hasn't gone that far, but she's done some really amazing work on using recurrent convolutional deep neural networks to actually identify the different limb positions and allow the device to function in different contexts. And so then the next step, I think, is what you were alluding to, which is we can use the system's interpretation of those contexts to better sculpt the training and the training pathway for the person and the device in different settings. Yeah, sorry, long-winded answer, but again, I would love to talk more on this exact point.
Absolutely, it's always a discussion, and there's a lot of avenues that the way it can be approached. It's obviously the exciting times right now. I'll mute myself and see if audience members have more questions. Prateek and Ashley, please jump in.
I have a question, but I want to give other people the chance to, because I've already asked a couple. So Ashley, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'll my responsibilities at the Amputee Coalition include a lot of policy discussion. And so equity and access are, huge issues that our organization has to contend with on a regular basis. And supporting the innovation landscape, I think, is something that we've got really good talking points on. But when we start to talk about sort of patient-centric processes that are inclusive of a policy and access concept, this part of the world, sort of, the clinical delivery and those pieces start to separate a bit. And so, clearly you're in Alberta. What is your perspective? Not necessarily needing you to speak to policy, but what is your perspective on access at this point, and what would be helpful for you all to be more comfortable about getting this to the people who can use it most?
Yeah, thanks. I will say I am not an expert on Health Canada policy and deployment. I do know, again, we're doing upper and lower limb osseointegration now on site here, and we have a big pilot study, especially for upper limb osseointegration, that has made us acutely aware of the requirement for interventional testing and exemptions and things like that for research devices. So I'm going to step aside from that. Say I am not the expert in those things. One thing I will say is that it's funny when I think about the kinds of machine learning technologies that we are deploying and the access that people might have to them, it's very much like access to physical technologies. And so when you see like, oh, hey, cool, someone comes out of the clinic, they've got a brand new sparkly prosthetic limb. They're like, I'd love to have a cell phone on here. So what do? They go to the library and they 3D print themselves a cell phone holder, and they double-sided tape, or they glue it onto the arm in a really robust way in just the position they need. And now they've just adapted their device. Now, clearly that changes the weight of the system. It changes this. Does it lead to repetitive shoulder injuries? We don't know. Like, we don't actually have studies on these, but people are going to, because of access to information and access to technologies, people quite rightly, I think in many cases, are going to try to help their device become what they need it to be. And so computationally speaking, this is also true. Now I will not say that like, what I'm going to say next is not something I want anyone to do. And I know we can excerpt video, so I'm going to try to word it very carefully. There are very powerful machine learning systems that I think we all see in the world around us, and people are now using them writ large in any way that they see fit, and they're able to deploy them in any way that they see fit. And that just causes I think it causes a substantial challenge for every field, but especially for a field like rehabilitation, especially in upper limb prosthetics, because people now can access technologies, both computational and physical, that they might not have been able to otherwise. The reliability of those technologies may or may not be like verified or certified. And I think everyone is grappling with this right now. So I feel like what we're going to see is a tsunami of access, but what's being accessed might be of such a high like heterogeneity of reliability and technical excellence that I don't know how to deal with that. So I think we're going to see lots of deployments. So what I'll say what our approach is then, because that's something I can like actually talk about. And I think our approach has been to really try to build a good solid international community for the technologies we develop. So we release, like I showed you actually the hand on the, I don't know if the slide is still visible to you, but like that's the handy hand from our lab. It's a hand designed with machine learning in mind. And we've open sourced all of this. So we essentially have like free open access technology. The physical platforms are all available on our BlinkDev community. We interact with hospitals, with industry, with prosthetic industry, and also with research institutions all across the globe, and work and improve the technology with them, and like develop technologies that are explicitly sourced with supply chain parts that can be found all across the globe, not just say North America centric. Like we talked to our colleagues out in Ecuador, hey, can you buy this motor to build this hand? And they're like, no. And then so we go back to the drawing board and trying to find how, in terms of the physical parts, that we can start to create something that can be accessible in both research and maybe someday deployment across the globe. So we've tried to work really hard to make that inexpensive in all locales, including like hundreds of dollars, not thousands or hundreds of thousands. And the same thing's true for compute. So we're very much working on systems that are low compute need, so that you don't have to have privileged access to Amazon Web Services or something like that to run your models. By model, I mean the computational system that bridges that gap between the person and machine. We're really trying to build things, especially continual learning. That's why I love it so much. Is it's low compute, it's incremental. You can put it on like microcontrollers, and so hopefully inexpensive microcontrollers, low compute needs, and other kinds of widely accessed and supply chain friendly parts are one way forward. That's just my pitch. Again, I'm not a policy expert, but that's what we've been pushing for. And I hope that's aligned with how actually policy change is maybe unfolding in the world. If not, I would love to hear that, so we can like change our approach. But
Thank you so much.
I know we are out of time, but I've got a very quick question, which is, where do you stand in the clinical translation pipeline? And if it is already in the clinical phase, are you actually looking at, or have you looked at, a functional comparison between conventional control mechanisms and the adaptive control mechanism?
yeah, so I guess I think we're very, very lucky here at the University of Alberta. Like my division is based in my division is based in the Glenrose Rehabilitation Hospital, though my lab's on campus. My closest collaborator is Dr. Jacqueline Hebert, and she is an expert in an adult upper limb amputation, lower limb amputation, and rehabilitation care, and also an amazing biotechnology researcher. And so we co-lead a lab together, we co-fund our team, and we work very closely with our colleagues at the Glenrose Hospital. So we do have a really good flow pathway between fundamental, like bench to bedside. Essentially, it's very much like we have folks with limb difference coming into lab regularly from the Glenrose Hospital, and so we can try out some of these ideas. The adaptive switching work in particular, that the survey in Prosthetics and Orthotics International, we did have conventional control compared with the adaptive switching control by someone with an upper limb amputation, and we've worked over the years in a variety of ways to make sure we do those comparisons. I think the big thing where I'd like to see growth is in the longer term take home trials. This clearly requires a lot more, again, a more regulatory approvals to make that a go. But I think that's the big gap in how we've compared, is that it's traditionally been in lab or in hospital comparisons, and that doesn't really reflect the conditions of daily life, even though we do our best to build task suites and environments that reflect daily life environments, coffee tables and things like that, daily life manipulation tasks. It's not the same as someone living their daily life. And so I think that would be a gap where I would love for us to work a bit more concertedly. And I think we will, again, with these upper limb osseointegration trials that are going to begin. I think we're going to see more of that deployed into daily life environments. That's my hope anyway.
Awesome. Thank you, Patrick. I'm going to pause recording now. Thank you so much for this amazing talk. I think the audience members were very excited about